All right, old friends, new friends, everyone else, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of Talking Buffalo, your weekday daily driver for Buffalo Sports Talk and more. My name is Patrick Moran. Thank you to everyone out there, as always, for listening to the show, watching, however you consume Talking Buffalo. I appreciate you guys very much. Shout out to our two sponsors, Sunny Reds, 1841 Abbott Road, 50-cent wings on Wednesdays, dollar chicken tenders on Thursdays. One of my favorite places to hang out. And also, of course, Imperial Pizza, 1035 Abbott Road. Best lunch special in town. Also got 20 wings for $20 on Monday nights now. Tuesdays, $15. All you can eat pasta. Make sure you check out Imperial Pizza. All right, folks, I got a good one for you today, man. It's been a while. It's been a hot minute since I've had my guy on, Matthew Fairburn from The Athletic. Last time I had you on, I believe, was with Baker at Imperial Pizza. And I think that was right after Don Granado got fired, if I remember correctly. It was a fun show. What's going on, Matt? How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well. How are you, Pat?
Pretty good. Pretty good. Living the dream. Busy. Finally nice weather out here. I know you got a lot going on, and we're going to get to a story that made me want to reach out to you. I thought it was an awesome story. Terry Pegula, Kevyn Adams, the hamster wheel of the Sabres playoff drought. You dropped it on The Athletic this week. Really good stuff. I want to talk a little bit about putting that story together. I'm always interested with you, Tim, Tyler Dunn. When a feature story comes together, I'm always kind of interested in like the details a little bit. And I know a lot of people who listen to the show like to read your stuff would be as well. So I want to talk about that a little bit, the story itself, maybe a little Sabres if we got some time here at the end. Let me ask you a question, though, because you've been covering the Sabres now for a while. Obviously, Buffalo sports fans know that you covered the Bills before. You covered the Patriots as well before. Do you miss at times covering the NFL? Now, I know you get to wet your beak still a little bit with some Bills stuff here and there at the Athletic, especially, if Joe's out for whatever reasons. But for the most part, you are entrenched now in hockey. Do you miss covering the NFL at any point, any times?
Not as much as time goes on, I feel like. I think during the transition, there's times where you're kind of wanting what's comfortable, right? You spend, I think, 8, 9 seasons, whatever it was, covering the NFL, developing relationships and just learning the ins and outs of that beat, and you start to feel pretty comfortable with it. But in terms of, especially lately with the Sabres, a lot of people would look at it and think, the Bills are a perennial Super Bowl contender and the Sabres are a doormat, one of the worst franchises, arguably the worst franchise in the NHL. But it has, I think this week's a good example of the story I wrote. Like, it has just lent itself to some fascinating stories, and trying to figure out how a franchise becomes what the Sabres have become has been a really challenging and really rewarding kind of beat, because people are still, against all odds, really engaged in, maybe not as engaged as they would be, or would have been 15, 20 years ago with the Sabres, but there's still a lot of people. Like, this is still a treasured asset in this community and a treasured team. And there's a real responsibility with kind of finding some of the answers and shedding some light on some things for these diehard fans. So at times, like, I like both the NFL and the NHL. So there's times where but like you said, I get a little bit of a taste here and there. And it feels like there's so many stories to be told on this Sabres beat that it really has been a fun challenge.
Now, look, you're not going to ever sit there. You're not going to root for the Sabres to win. You're not going to root for the Sabres to lose. You're going to cover the team and objectively, and I know you well enough to know that. And I got to ask you, is the old media adage true? I hear this a lot, that covering a team that's middling, that's middle of the road, a 500 team is boring. Like, you're better off in terms of content, having things to talk about, and in terms of what people want to consume. Are you better off covering a team that is either really, really good, like, say, the Florida Panthers, for an example, or covering a team that's really, really bad perennially, like the Buffalo Sabres, in terms, like I said, of just interest? Like, if you can't be good, it's better to be bad. It's not as fun when a team is just middle of the pack every year.
It's interesting. I feel like with the Sabres, middle of the pack would be different, right? It would be, I think
That's true.
part of the key that I've noticed, or the pattern that I've noticed, because I've heard the same thing as you, and I think it does hold true to an extent. If you're not covering a team that's pushing for championships, then you kind of want the train wreck. But I feel like with the Sabres, and I think generally speaking, you could probably say this about the Bills too. It's almost like you just want something fresh, something different, something
Yeah.
unique in some way. And that's almost where the Sabres beat has been compelling to me compared to the Bills, in that sometimes, especially now that I'm a little bit more removed from the Bills, I look at it and think, man, this seems like the same story every year until you hit January. It's like the story starts in January and you start, the rest of it is
Yeah.
just kind of filler, keeping people busy. Like we all know during the regular season, what everybody's all upset about. They're going to figure it out enough to get to the playoffs and be one of those teams because they have Josh Allen. They have a good coach. They have, a good program in place with, so then you're kind of just seeing, how's this story going to end? What is it going to be different? Are there going to be little things along the way? The Sabres are almost repetitive in the same way because they're so bad, but they're doing it. They're finding new and inventive ways to be bad and to be interesting in that way. I mean, this season I would not have predicted the 7 or 8 wild things that happened along the way to them becoming what they became. And part of what made this story that I wrote this week, particularly relevant was the fact that Kevyn Adams became sort of this main character in the NHL. Everybody wondering, who is this guy talking about palm trees and taxes? They became a national story in hockey. And so, yeah, to an extent, I think you're right. You either want to be really good or really bad. But part of me thinks if the Sabres were the 14th best team in the league, people around here, they would treat it
Yeah.
the same way they treat the Bills right now in some ways. Like getting back to the playoffs would be an incredible story. So you're looking for just fresh, different, and certainly the Sabres have a way of providing that in their own way.
I'll tell you too, and you mentioned Josh Allen and the team finding a way, and maybe we'll get to this before the end of the show. But when I look at the Sabres and I see Tage Thompson, one of the best forwards in the NHL right now, and Rasmus Dahlin, one of the best defensemen in the NHL, and they got franchise caliber type players, but yet they just can't put things together. And this season, just innovative ways to not even just lose, but also sometimes embarrass themselves, whether it was during the game, whether it was during a media scrum or whatever it may be, just innovative ways, scoring on themselves, having a goalie score on them. Just one of those, to your point, memorable seasons. Before we dive into your story, one last thing, too. Talk about the podcast that you guys do now. You and Chris Baker, of course. It's my favorite Sabres podcast by far because you and Chris have a knack. And again, I got to sit down with both you guys for a show last year at Imperial, and I enjoy the podcast. It just feels really it feels conversational more than anything else. It's like you guys are just sitting there having a conversation. Obviously, talking Sabres and hockey and stuff, but there's a comfort level, just like you had with Joe B when you guys were doing, your thing every week too, when it was with the Bills. But now you got that with Baker too in hockey. It's just it really feels like a comfortable conversational podcast that I enjoy.
I appreciate it. I'm glad you brought it up because Chris was busting my balls the other night for not plugging it on a different show I was on. So people can find the Baker Fairburn Hockey Show on YouTube or wherever they get their podcasts. Subscribe, leave a 5-star review. Do it for Chris.
Do it for Chris, yeah.
But yeah, it's, Chris and I talk so regularly when we're not podcasting that I think it helps make the show pretty easy. We obviously prep and, have a show sheet and topics that we're going to hit, but then the chat steers us in different directions. It's one of the fun parts about the show is that I think there's only one podcast in the 70 or so that we've done that we didn't do live. And we keep talking about how we're going to do, some pre-recorded ones so we can increase our frequency. But there's something about the live element that really drives the show, and we've got a little community going. And so, yeah, it's I think Chris is probably the smartest hockey guy in media in Buffalo as far as just seeing the game and the way he views it. So I love being able to pick his brain. I think it's a good dynamic where, he's got a wealth of knowledge about, he remembers all these guys when they were 17, 18, coming out of the draft, all these NHL players. And I'm there every day. So we have kind of a good, good mix of skill sets that we can bring to the table. And obviously just a good rapport from, talking, like I said, probably pretty close to every day as it is, whether we're doing a podcast or not. So it makes it pretty easy.
And Chris is an all-time smartass, and I mean that in the most affectionate, loving kind of way possible. I love having conversations with him, man. He's queasy, he's very quick wit when he wants to be, for sure. All right, let's get into the story that you just dropped this past week with the Athletic. Let me ask you this, okay, Matt, from start to finish, okay, when you do this type of story, when there's like a lot of nuance and layers to a story, and there's multiple people that you're talking to, both on the record, off the record, whatever, how long does a story like this take typically, to come together from fruition? Like I said, you talk to different people. I think it was like 10 people that you spoke with, plus you had to sit down for a full hour with Kevyn Adams. Like when you put a story together like this, from the concept of the idea that you want to do this until the point that it's published on The Athletic and people could go consume it, typically a story like this, how long does it take for you to put together?
This one was unique in that it was probably from concept to finish almost a year, which is different because I say that because around this time last year, we started talking, as a staff with my editor. I've actually changed editors since then, but, with different editors at the company about like the big picture question of what is going on with the Sabres and how, this long drought, everybody around the league knows it as a proud market, a proud fan base. And each spring, it seems like the question is, what is going on? Like, how has it gotten to this point? And that's such a big question to tackle. And so it took some time to sort of wrap my arms around like the best way to do that. And that's where, some of the work was done last summer to, some of the background work to start this story. But then you're wondering, okay, is this a preseason story? And if it's not a preseason story, does it kind of just get tabled and put in the background and you chip away at it and wait to see how the story evolves, which is sort of how we handled it. And it actually ended up, if you remember, I wrote a story about the Sabres attendance problems and sort of the state of the fan base, state of business in the spring. This ended up as kind of two stories in a way. So like we were talking about the drought and how it happened and the impact and Terry Pegula's ownership, all these things. And it just became pretty clear that we were dealing with almost a book's worth of subject matter and material, and we were going to have to really narrow the focus. So it ended up getting split and say, let's talk about the business, the fans, the people, sort of the human aspect of this for everyday Sabres fans. And then let's sort of try to zoom in on some of the inner workings of how this happened. And Kevyn Adams became, like I said earlier, a main character, right? He had that press conference in December. Even from opening night, he gets introduced and everybody's booing him. And I'm just thinking, this guy is this dynamic between Pagula, Adams, and the fans really is a real, hot button issue for people. And how can we sort of drill down on why that is and maybe separate fact from fiction a little bit? I think the narrative of Kevyn Adams has become sort of a runaway train, especially since December. And being able to lay out the facts, lay out the timeline, and provide some context helps explain the drought in a lot of ways, because Kevyn Adams and Terry Pegula's relationship began almost at the beginning of the drought. And while Adams wasn't involved in hockey decisions for the first 9 years, he was around and he was building this relationship with Pagula, and Pagula putting him in place to be the GM informs a lot of, who Terry is as an owner and the decisions he makes. And then, of course, the last 5 years are all under Adams' watch. So that's sort of how we thought about the story and these two characters as sort of parallel characters, putting it together. And it was a process, even from the end of the season, like some of the edits. This went through so many drafts, so much stuff hit the cutting room floor. And, um, at one point it was like a 5,000 word story. I think we ended up a little over 3,000. So a lot of that stuff goes into it too, where there's hours and hours and hours of conversations that, you're using 5 or 10 minutes of it, because we were really focused on, particularly the bar for using anonymous sources at our company is like, these people need to be providing some critical information like events and things that happened, and to advance the story. And they need to have a legitimate reason for, not using their name. So there's a bar we had to clear, where this was not just going to be a case of picking up the phone and be like, tell me the worst thing you want to say about Kevyn Adams, like unload, go ahead, take all the shots you want. We really took a lot of care to try to be fair, which is kind of the interesting thing about when you have a fan base as rabid as this one. They're almost like, they feel like you're being too fair, right? They want you to really go in for it. But it was something where we wanted to, and that's why I'm glad Kevyn spoke, is that he's able to kind of have his side in there as well, and people can make up their mind on draw their own conclusions.
Well, I'll tell you this, man. One of the best compliments I could give is that you said the story ended up being a little over 3,000 words. And sometimes when I read a story, even if I find it really compelling, and when a story's that long, I feel like I'm surviving the end of it. You know what I mean? I never felt that way when I read this story. Like, even when it was at the very end, I'm like, oh, okay. Like, I was like, is there more? You know what I mean? I kept going and going, and I never got really bored with it. I got to ask you this. Do you and other writers who may cover the beat or just or write stories at this point, is it even worth like bothering trying to get Terry Pegula on the record anymore? I mean, it's a lost cause. He's not going to speak. I get that. But just knowing when you start a story that it'll involve him, that the fact that he's just not going to speak as a journalist, does that bother you at all, knowing that the owner's just not going to talk, whether it's for your story here or whether it's for something different, you know what I mean? Whether it's a feature story or whatever it may be, he doesn't talk. And as somebody who covers the team, can that be a little difficult to navigate, or is it just something at this point, Matthew, that you're just used to?
I'm used to it. I did ask when I was in the process of asking for Adams. And so the way when I asked for Adams, I had a draft written. This is part of why the story dropped at the beginning of June and not like early May or beginning of May. I forget exactly the day that Kevyn and I sat down, but I had a draft written, which is how I prefer to go about a situation like this, is like, let's act as if I'm not going to get any of these people. And it's sort of a lesson that goes back to very early on when I was, in journalism school, complaining to a professor or an editor about, oh, so-and-so won't pick up the phone. It's like, I think I was doing a Gary Pinkel story at Mizzou, and it's like, well, you're not going to get Pinkel, so get as many people that have been close to Pinkel as possible. It'll probably be more interesting anyways. And sort of shaped my thinking in that way. But I like to be prepared as if I won't get him. And so then when I did get him, it's like, oh, okay, this is interesting. But with Pagula, I think in a way, especially now that I have this understanding and background on the dynamic between Adams and Pagula, it feels like Adams is, a proxy in some ways for Pagula and how he speaks. Of course, Terry would say some different things, and getting Terry specifically on some of these things would be helpful. But, when we were talking about Kevyn, I did mention like, hey, I know it's a long shot, but would be happy to have Terry's voice here as well, if he's in any way interested. But the fact that Kevyn at least sat down, because I did that attendance story in the spring on sort of the state of business, and there was a lot of different things in there in terms of the challenges with everything happening with Canada and season ticket renewals and all sorts of things. And Pigula did not want to talk for that story. So, and Pigula talks plenty. And I think Kevyn speaking on this story, I told him this when we sat down, there's a lot of talk about accountability, but to me, that's kind of what it looks like. Regardless of what he says or the tone he says it in and how people interpret it, all of that, the fact that he was willing to sit down, have the dialogue, and face the music to an extent on a tough topic, like questions he was not wanting to answer at this stage in his career, and a story that he's not going to be hanging on his fridge or anything like that, is, I think, a little bit of what accountability looks like.
No, I agree 100%. And I call this a truth piece to me. It's a truth piece. It's a combination, like I said, of events, stories, quotes from player or from scouts, sources, and facts. And as a Sabres fan, it can infuriate you reading something like this. You know what I mean? Don't kill the messenger, but you're looking. I mean, you wrote about this right off the bat at the beginning of the story, too. Pagula's 14 full seasons here. They've missed the playoffs more than they have in the 40 years prior to that, and that they've been near the bottom of the league in attendance that you wrote about, and that they've had at least $6 million in cap space, each of these last 5 years. As a fan, that could be infuriating. And I do give credit to Kevyn Adams for sitting down and, like you said, at least to some extent, facing the music, so to speak. Do you get a sense of how much Kevyn Adams reads, listens, watches all the what he would consider outside noise coming from, from newspapers, from outlets like The Athletic, from blogs, podcasts, TV, whatever it may be? Obviously, of course, fans is too. I mean, God forbid the guy has a birthday and it's put on Twitter. Don't go into the mentions. You know what I mean? How much do you get a sense of how much he's locked in, how much he pays attention to what's being said, written about him?
There's an awareness for sure, whether it's him personally sitting down to read it all or stuff getting relayed to him. It probably depends on the particular, content, right? And, I don't know personally whether he's reading The Athletic every morning to see what I say or what I write.
Sure.
It's possible he does once in a while. Like, to me, that seems like it would be something that could potentially work your way into your habits, right? Because you might be reading The Athletic for other things if you're an NHL GM and looking around the league. So it could be easy for something like that, or grabbing the paper. There's not as much to pay attention to as if you're Sean McDermott or Brandon Beane, right? Where there's so many things you can't possibly read it all. So I think there's definitely an awareness and a sensitivity to some of the things. I asked him, and it didn't make it into the story, but he did acknowledge that everything that happened, basically, probably, I guess, from opening night, but really from palm trees on, like all that negativity, it was hard. It did impact him and his family. Like, it was hard, to, as a guy that's from here, a guy that really only a couple of years ago was, and everybody I talked to for this story, qualified everything with this is he's a really nice guy, and he honest guy, and member of the community. Kids go to school here, he grew up here. So I think that part was hard for him, but he also was saying I'm not, I was able to compartmentalize. He's like, I'm not going to sit here and ask for sympathy. This is the job. So I think there's an awareness, but I wonder if maybe there's less of one now. Maybe he's less in the weeds, because you would almost have to start to remove yourself. I think a few years ago, there were times where he would say things or pull you aside where you're like, oh, I didn't think you'd be, aware of that or paying attention to that. But now I almost wonder if it's for his own mental health and his own ability to, focus and compartmentalize, that he can't be wrapped up in. And frankly, a lot of it is repetitive, right? Like you said, they post about his birthday and it's, fire this guy. He's almost felt the worst of it at this point, to where maybe he doesn't need to be in the weeds so much anymore.
Yeah, look, man, I feel sometimes for some of these guys, players, coaches, it's like their birthday. I'd be like, social media, please you don't need to,
Right.
you don't need to, don't tweet out that it's my birthday. That's not a good thing. Anyway, let's take a real quick break, come back on the other side. I want a couple specific things that I wanted to ask you about this story. So folks, we'll be right back. I am back here with Matthew Fairburn fighting a cold. Got a sore throat going on today. Anyway, excellent story in The Athletic. They're on a hamster wheel. Said another, this is a quick excerpt, and I can't emphasize this enough to everyone out there. If you haven't read the story already, go read it, man. What are we doing here? They're on a hamster wheel, said another former Sabres scout. They just keep going around in circles. That quote has just stuck with me since reading it because it's such a strong statement, and it's coming from a former scout. It's true. I mean, that feels pretty accurate to you, doesn't it? It's just everything just feels like it keeps going around in circles with the Sabres now.
Yeah, that was part of why, when we were talking about headlines and stuff, that was the quote that stuck with me because it sums everything up, not just Adams. I think you can talk about Adams' tenure, and it's a bit of a hamster wheel, right? It's like every sign of perceived progress, they're still in the same place, or maybe even going backwards in some cases. And certainly the last couple of years, they've been going backwards. And it's like every little bit of progress or every different thing they've tried, they end up in the exact same place. And I think that is, there's been an element, and I think, again, this is maybe just my writer brain and, thinking about things in terms of structure and the art form of writing, but it's part of why Adams can sort of explain the drought in some ways. It's like, how many times over the years have they put somebody in a position before they were ready for the position, right? Or tried to take shortcuts in different ways, whether it was going back to spending all this money in free agency to try to shortcut, building a championship team, or tanking, thinking that getting to the bottom and getting one player would fix everything, and then giving that player the captaincy before I think most people would have said that he was ready, and then giving Adams the general manager job before he had really paid his dues on the hockey ops side, and then having all these young players put really high in the lineup or put right into starting jobs in the case of Devin Levi before they had gone through the development process, the typical development process that most players need to go through. So I think that's where the hamster wheel analogy is a good one. It's like all these different things that you've tried to shortcut, tried to do, you end up back in the same place. I mean, they were 3 points better this season than they were in Don Granato's first full season when they were icing a roster that was really not close, in terms of experience and caliber to the one that they have now. So it's kind of crazy when you think about it in those terms.
One of the things that you wrote in regards to Kevyn Adams and his lack of experience in this role, you wrote of the currently employed NHL GMs, Adams, one of 6 who never held an assistant general manager or VP of hockey operations title in NHL. And of those 6, he's only one of 2 who's never scouted or consulted in the NHL hockey's operations department. That is pretty wild. And you know what? I think, Matt, I read the mentions, and I've obviously I've read your story, the tweet, a lot of replies to it. I think for a lot of people, the part about the Buffalo Bills mattering much more than the Sabres might be the single most frustrating part for true blue Sabre fans, because Terry Pegula's just so much involved in everything that they do. And a quick little excerpt from what you wrote. You said everything Bills was always more important than everything Sabres, said one former Pagula employee who worked on the hockey site. It's just been helter-skelter for the Sabres ever since he bought the Bills. You get that sense? I certainly did, looking at some of the comments that, for people who are, again, diehard Sabres fans, it's I don't want to say Terry Pegula doesn't care about the Sabres, because that would be utterly ridiculous to say that. That's not accurate. But there's a school of thought that he does seem to care a lot more about the Bills than he does the Sabres. And as a hockey fan, especially if you're a hockey fan first, that could really frustrate you, ain't it?
Yeah, I think a lot of stuff in this story, probably including that, if it confirmed fears that and suspicions that Sabres fans have had. And that one's probably the biggest one, because, to hear it from somebody who would know, right, who is in the weeds with it all, is confirmation of the clues that the actions will tell you, right? And I think that's why it was important to me to highlight the beginning of Terry Pegula's ownership and the
Yeah.
investment that he did have and what that looked like at the ground level, like what it really looked like, the scenes and the involvement, going to Traverse City for prospect tournaments and hanging around all the time. It is, to your point, Terry Pegula cares about the Buffalo Sabres. Terry Pegula wants to win. Like I don't believe for a second that it would be ridiculous to even own the team, if you didn't care about those things. And we know that he was a fan of this team before he bought it. But I also think it would be impossible to sit here and say that he could give the same care and attention to the Sabres before, after he bought the Bills as he did before he bought the Bills. And especially, and as part of what's outlined in the story, with how the organization has been structured and the resources, devoted to each side. Like they have a COO of both teams. He came from the New York Giants, right? He came without a lot of without any NHL experience. And that's been the case for every president and COO they've had since they fired Ted Black. There was Russ Brandon, Ron Raccuia, Kim Pagula obviously held, those titles at one point. Bruce Popko was here. He had a pretty long NFL resume. Raccuia was an NFL agent and very much an NFL guy who, frankly, I don't think cared too much about the Sabres. Russ Brandon, football guy, right? Baseball a little bit, Picawelli, football guy, basketball a little bit. And, you have a guy in a really important position dividing his time. You have Terry Pegula dividing his time. He's not at as many things as he used to be. He's still around, but he would be with the team much more if it weren't for the Bills. Some of that's understandable. The Bills are big business. The Bills they're a really good team for one. So I think it's more fun to be an NFL owner, go to one game a week and, shown on TV, and you got your big superstar quarterback, your great team, you're playing in these big games on national stage all the time, but it's also a big money-making enterprise. Like it is making money hand over fist, and you barely have to lift a finger to make money in the NFL. Meanwhile, the hockey team is just a constant headache. So I think, plus when you think about the fact that they're building a stadium, right? That big, massive project that is undoubtedly taking up a ton of Goelli's time and Pagula's time. Of course, the Sabres are going to be a little bit more of an afterthought, which again brings it back to Kevyn Adams and why that trust and that foundation, that relationship that they built is so central to everything. Because let's face it, if Terry Pegula did not know Kevyn Adams before he hired him, he probably would have fired him by now. But there's an element of this guy being, like I said before, kind of a proxy for ownership. He kind of was even before in that vice president of business administration role when he's going to owners meetings and sitting in on different meetings for Kim Pagula. And so when you don't have as much time to be in the weeds, or it's not your only thing, it's easy for you to say, well, let's ride it out with this guy that we really trust, and we'll kind of figure it out. Things are going great over here in Orchard Park. Can spend some time over there. It's hard to be two places at once, and especially when you layer in everything he has going on personally with Kim's health. I think it was probably easier to divide and conquer when Kim was healthy and really involved, and now Laura, his daughter, is a little bit more involved. But Jesse's got her tennis career, and the other kids aren't quite old enough, I don't think, to be taking on real leadership roles. So Laura, gets some of that responsibility, and they're figuring it out. It's still only been a few years since Kim's health took a turn, so it's some of it is understandable, but the fact that it's spelled out, I think, in plain English for people is the frustrating part, because there's a lot of people that are hockey first people in this town that really care about the Sabres and want them to get the same attention and love that the Bills get. And right now it doesn't feel like they're getting that even from the owner.
We're going to start to wind down here. I want to make sure I frame this right. One of, I would say, the criticisms of Kevyn Adams. Yeah, I guess it's a criticism. I mean, you know what? It would be me too. I say make it sound like other people. And one of my criticisms too of Kevyn Adams is that he's too much. It feels like he's too much of a yes man. Like to some extent, basically. And I mean, you did such a good job of laying out, the lack of experience and stuff. Yet he gets hired as a general manager. He's perceived as a guy who's going to say yes to whatever Terry says. I have this running joke on the show about him being a yes man to the point, and this is unfair, but I say it anyway. I'll be like, well, Kevyn Adams will say, my favorite color is blue. Terry will be like, no, it ain't. Your favorite color is green. And Kevyn will be like, well, you know what? Actually, you know what? It is green. I've been saying that kind of as a joke for the most part, but in all seriousness, that's a perception of him being a yes man, not standing up. And that might be why he still very much has a job right now at this point. And part in the story you wrote about Adams, he said that he's honest with Pagula about what's wrong with this team, some of the mistakes, and you outlined. He mentioned puck management and defense and special teams. Well, I got to ask you this then. There's the two coaches that are in charge of special teams still got a job right now. Like, doesn't that make Kevyn Adams sound specifically, and maybe I'm being a little dramatic with this, but a little bit weak? You know what I mean? Like you're saying our special teams, basically saying what I was saying, our special teams stunk last year, which they did stink, and they've stunk for a while now. But yet, where's the coaching changes? Like, that's what makes people think, well, does Kevyn Adams have any kind of sway with Terry Pegula? Because it's like, why has there not been coaching changes?
Yeah, I don't doubt, I asked Kevyn pretty much directly about the idea that he doesn't, stand up to Pagula. And I outlined that Taylor Hall moment as one that a lot of people point to as one where he just was not willing to speak. He either believed what Terry Pegula said about them being a Stanley Cup contender and went along with it, or he didn't believe it but was not confident enough to say it to Terry Pegula.
Right.
And, he took issue with that. And I wrote, or I paraphrased his stance on that he is willing to push back. But I think to your point, there is probably on these big issues and maybe an unwillingness, or I don't know. The actions tell you, like, they haven't spent to the salary cap. How many general managers in the NHL would say, yeah, that's a viable winning strategy, particularly when you're in a flat cap environment that the NHL was in for 4 of the 5 years, I believe, that he's been general manager. I think the cap went up last year, but it hasn't gone up in previous years. Like, no NHL GM would say, sure, I'll take a job where I can't spend to the salary cap. Or where, look, if that's your strategy, because you're kicking the can down the road and these other contracts are coming up, then you've punted 5 years away, and you're playing with one hand behind your back. The year they got 91 points, they had like $17 million in salary cap space unspent. Like, that might be one of the best points per dollar spent coaching jobs in NHL history from Don Granato, right? And then the next year, they don't do anything to the roster. He gets fired. And again, the hamster wheel, right, of bringing in a new coach who needs new players. So to your point about the coaching staff, it was the coaching staff's fault when they went from 91 to 84. When they go from 84 to 79, I guess it was the strength coach's fault. He's the only one that's been swapped out. When we spoke a few weeks ago, Adams said, they're sort of, in evaluation mode, in the sense that if there's an upgrade available, or even if they could add to the current staff and not subtract anybody, something that they might be open to. They've made additions to the front office, but you do wonder, part of it is that it's Lindy Ruff, right? Lindy Ruff has sway with Terry Pegula. He has a long relationship with him as well, going back to when Pagula first bought the team. And he has, I would say, quite a bit more cachet and around the league and within the building, just because of what he meant to this team as a player and as a coach in his first stint. So swapping out the head coach was never realistic, but the fact that he didn't bring any assistants with him, and that the only assistant change was a video coach from Rochester and Seth Appert coming in, and then the power play is still not very good, the penalty kill is not very good, you would think it's a logical place to at least put some window dressing on this thing, right? And say like, look, we're changing things. The strength coach is kind of a hard sell for me. Not that it wasn't necessary. It's hard for me to say one way or the other whether it was necessary. I don't think Ed Gannon was responsible for the injuries or the team fading in the third period. But if they feel like there's a competitive advantage to be gained with a new coach, then by all means. But it's hard to imagine that there's not also an edge to be gained with, because it needs to be said also that this staff, outside of Mike Bales, who is the goalie coach, prior to their jobs with the Sabres, this is not an experienced staff. I mean, Appert is somewhat because he was an AHL head coach and longtime college coach, so he makes sense. But Matt Ellis before that and Marty Wilford, this is not a super experienced staff at the NHL level outside of their experience in Buffalo. So Lindy Ruff, though, from what I gather, is the type of guy that wouldn't necessarily push for, like when he got the job, it's not surprising to a lot of people that know him that he wasn't bent out of shape about who his assistants were, because his thought is, I can fix this. I can handle it. Don't worry about it. Give me whoever you want. I'll fix it. There was a running joke when the Sabres were kind of like didn't have a captain or were rotating captains or whatever. It's like, yeah, we don't need a captain. Like Lindy's the captain, like he's kind of the alpha in the building type of thing. So I think he has that mindset when it comes to his staff. It's like he takes it personally. Like it's his responsibility. If his staff's not performing that well, that's on him. So there's still time for them to upgrade the staff. It happens sometimes later in the summer, but obviously the biggest window of coaching change, we're sort of towards the tail end of it right now. And so far it's status quo, but who knows, maybe some of these additions to the front office change something in terms of, wanting to get a different a different voice behind the bench in some way.
Last question here, and I'm going to let you go. So there's a lot going on. The draft in a couple of weeks, free agency. The combine's going on in Buffalo after we're done recording. I know you're going to be covering that. How do you see this summer playing out, like for the Sabres? And you don't have to give me like specific players, but what I'm asking you is, do you see this as a team right now that plans on being like maybe uber aggressive, like trying to get taking a swing for a Mitch Marner, or trying to make a big swing trade or free agent signing? Or do you see this as a team that's just going to kind of like, I hate to say it this way, but kind of like stay the course? And I don't mean do nothing. They're going to do something. We all know that. But you know what I mean? Like maybe taking care of their own, maybe a mid to moderate type of trade or signing, or opposed to, like I said, kind of swinging for the fence. Does this team feel, in your mind, after spending time, let me ask you this, after spending time with Kevyn Adams like you just did for the story, do you get a sense that it's desperation time for this team this summer? Like they really need to do everything they possibly can, but do you have an owner that might hamstring some of what you want to do?
I think a few clues, the additions they made to the front office, particularly Jarmo Kekalainen, he has a history of bold decisions, bold trades, pretty fearless as the general manager of the Blue Jackets. Some mixed results, obviously. Anybody who is out of work and becomes a senior advisor probably had some misses that led to them being out of work, but he had a decisive, bold quality about him that I think will serve Kevyn Adams particularly well. I would say that another Dylan Cousins level trade is in the cards. I think whether it's Bo Byram, JJ Peterka, those feel like the two likeliest candidates because of their RFA status and just sort of the pressure that comes with that timeline that they're on. But this is the reason I would say that Kevyn Adams, whether he's desperate or not, is going to be in a situation where he's going to have to make some big moves because they have some significant RFAs and they have Alex Tuck eligible for a contract extension on July 1st. Not all of those, it's impossible for all of those situations to be completely copacetic and work out favorably for the team. And so there's going to have to be something's going to have to give one way or the other. Some moves are going to have to be made. Does Peterka want a long-term deal? And if he doesn't, does that motivate you to cash in on his value while it's at probably an all-time high? Same goes for Bo Byram, and same goes for Alex Tuck. Like, if he does not want a contract, you have to be somewhat proactive. Maybe you hang on to him for the final year of his deal and see what happens, but there's also an element of needing to be proactive because of he's coming off a great year as well. So between having Kekalainen here and having the other thing about Kekalainen coming in and Eric Stahl to an extent tells me that there is some level of urgency from Terry Pegula, and that if I think he will open the wallet at the right time, and if this isn't the right time, then I don't know what is. Like, I feel like you need to. I think he was sort of sold a bill of goods in some ways that, like, oh, if we just stay the course, we'll sign all these guys to extensions. And it is to some extent a challenge to, spend the money in free agency for the sake of spending it, because they're not going to be an attractive free agent destination. But there are some guys out there in free agency too. Should they make a run at Mitch Marner? I would say they should. I would say if you want to signal to your fan base and to the rest of the league that you're serious, you find a way to get yourself at least into the final mix. You can't control whether Marner's going to pick you or not, but you can control whether you're in the mix, right, and whether you can signal to teams like, wow, Buffalo's making a push for this guy. I think that would matter to the fans. I think it would matter around the league. And so it almost feels impossible for them to get through. It's different than last summer because of all these RFAs. It's like impossible for them to get through the summer without making a big move, or at least a mid-level move, because of, all these situations and how they're going to play out. I'm curious to see. I'm hoping, that the combine will bring a little bit more to light about where some of this is at, and maybe I'll have a firmer answer about maybe who those players are or who they might be able to take a run at in free agency. But I almost think this could be the first year under Adams that they are right up against the cap. And wouldn't it be something if that actually got them a playoff berth after all these years? Like, sometimes it's simple in the NHL. Like, it's hard. There's not that many teams. Last year, I remember the Capitals had the most cap space going into the playoffs with $1 million. And I think this year it was like maybe the Jets had like $1.5 million, right? Just for like leftover potential roster moves. Like, all these teams in the playoffs are right at the cap. So it seems like a pretty, especially with the big number of Jeff Skinner's buyout sitting on the cap this year, you're actually really not even spending to the cap. You're spending like $5 million under it because of that dead money. So if they don't do it this year, then they probably shouldn't introduce Adams on opening night, because it'll be loud.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, the team, at least for the time being, may stink, but they're interesting, and you do a great job of keeping things interesting as well. Make sure everybody you're following Matthew on Twitter at Matthew Fairburn. Check out the Baker Fairburn Hockey Show, and of course, The Athletic, man. Some really good work, man. Appreciate you very much, man.
Thanks so much for having me, Pat. Talk to you soon.
All right, guys, I will be back with a brand new show coming right up tomorrow. Talk to you then.